Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leon Andrews. I'm with the National League of Cities, serve as the director for REAL, which stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership. Welcome to NLC's webinar on how cities can address racial inequities. We're pleased today to have a panel that will provide a range of opportunities for us to really frame this conversation. Our CEO, Clarence Anthony, will provide some welcoming remarks, and then we'll be hearing from the White House, Jerry Abramson, who is the Deputy Assistant to the President Obama and Director of Intergovernmental Affairs. We're also pleased that we're joined by Chief Valerie McDonald Roberts, who will share some of the work that's happening in the city of Pittsburgh, and we'll have a chance to share what we are seeing around the country and what cities can do to respond to last week's events, but specifically what you can do to really address racial inequities. And then in our Q&A session, we're pleased to be joined by Julie Nelson, the Director of Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And Julie provides a wealth of knowledge of work that she's doing in cities across the country and will be a resource for the questions that you have as you're sharing ideas and are really asking what you can do as city leaders to respond to events. So we'd like to start to open today's webinar really with a quick short video that really reflects the voice of President Obama when he gave his remarks at the Dallas Memorial earlier this week.
Society, we choose to underinvest in decent schools. We allow poverty to fester so that entire neighborhoods offer no prospect for gainful employment. We refuse to fund drug treatment and mental health programs. We flood communities with so many guns that it is easier for a teenager to buy a Glock than get his hands on a computer or even a book. And then we tell the police, you're a social worker, you're the parent, you're the teacher, you're the drug counselor. We tell them to keep those neighborhoods in check at all costs and do so without causing any political blowback or inconvenience. Don't make a mistake that might disturb our own peace of mind. And then we feign surprise when periodically the tensions boil over. We know those things to be true. They've been true for a long time. We know it. Police, you know it. Protesters, you know it. You know how dangerous some of the communities where these police officers serve are. And you pretend as if there's no context. These things we know to be true. And if we cannot even talk about these things, if we cannot talk honestly and openly, not just in the comfort of our own circles, but with those who look different than us or bring a different perspective, then we will never break this dangerous cycle. In the end, it's not about finding policies that work. It's about forging consensus and fighting cynicism and finding the will to make change. Can we do this? Can we find the character as Americans to open our hearts to each other?
Great. Clarence?
Yes, thank you very much, Leon. And I do appreciate the President's words, and And I must tell you personally, the last week, our nation has really witnessed unthinkable violence in Baton Rouge and Minnesota, and of course in Dallas, Texas. And these events deeply affected everyone here at the National League of Cities, but most importantly for us as your staff in Washington, it's affected our cities and affected your citizens that live in the cities in our nation. You know, it also has caused all of us a lot of discomfort. You know, personally walking down the street in Washington or Atlanta or wherever I travel, all of a sudden, you know, people are not making eye contact. People, black and white, are not they are being more cautious around each other. And I can tell you it's been a very divisive week in our nation. And our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the victims and to everyone in communities who are reeling from the violence and the pain. And that word is used purposely. There's a lot of pain in our nation right now. One thing is clear is our nation must take action, though. We must address this deep, systematic inequities and racial tension and injustice that is in our cities. And this call today is National League of Cities saying we are here to be a partner with you and be a service to our members and to cities all over America. We are continuing to see disturbing trends as it relates to police and community relations and deadly force, if you will, against people of color, specifically black men. And the data says that. This is not something that we are creating as a way of talking about this. It is a fact. And our nation cities, we must look at what is our role as local officials, what is our responsibilities as leaders, really to create an inclusive community, one that fosters trust between the police and the people that they serve, and also just a place that people can call home, that they can drive around the street and not be profiled, but also a relationship with their police department that is sustainable and one that is personal. And we're committed to that. One of the things that we recognized last year and why we created the Race, Equity, and Leadership initiative was to help bring about inclusive communities and to help city leaders to be able to deal with the many challenges of race and equity in communities. Today's call is an opportunity to hear from you and to focus our time in a meaningful way so that we achieve action and to talk about what you can do as leaders to address racial inequities. We have an opportunity, as President Obama has been talking about, from the White House as well as the number of convenings that he has created. And the real point that I'd like to leave here is that we are a tool for city leaders and to provide solutions. And we are very, very committed to that. And yeah, I'm making a phone call. Thank you. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm good, officer. Thank you. And I'm honored to introduce Jerry Abramson, the Deputy Assistant to President and Director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Relations, to talk about the White House commitment and the relationship that we have and the commitment we have to helping cities all over America. So with that, Jerry, could you talk to us about what the President and the White House has committed to?
Thank you, Clarence, and thanks to the National League of Cities for, really being out ahead on this issue and creation of REAL. What you heard just a moment ago from President Obama, as you saw in the video screen, was given on Tuesday in Dallas. On Wednesday, that would be yesterday, the president feels so strongly about this issue that he gathered together some 30 or 35 police chiefs, mayors, governors, attorneys general, African-American activists, leaders, Latino leaders, academics, leadership of the NAACP, the FOP, the International Police Chiefs Organization, a representative from Black Lives Matter, leaders of the 21st Century Task Force, and they closed the door with no media in the room and sat there for 4.5 hours wrestling with the issues of police training, accountability, demonstrations, how police should respond, racial issues, criminal justice reform, data-driven opportunities, an initiative that literally 50 or 60 communities have now engaged in to develop the data to show some of the things that Clarence was just mentioning regarding who's getting pulled over and who's getting stopped and what's the profiling of those individuals. Those issues all are driven at the local level, and that's why I was so appreciative when Clarence asked me to get on, because as the president beats the drum for the need for folks to sit around a table and take their packs off, as they used to say in the military, and really engage in a dialogue where you both talk and listen, the bottom line is those kinds of things to bring about change are going to happen in only one place, and that's in the local communities, the cities of our country, where mayors and city council people are really pulling together individuals from throughout the community, young and old, black and white, Latino, educators, activists, to be able to interact and think a lot about issues like, for example, the 21st Century Task Force report on community policing. You know, what police departments are following those recommendations and which police departments are not. And if they're not, mayors and city council people need to ask their police chief why they're not and try to understand and decide whether you have the kind of progressive leadership that's necessary to engage in an appropriate approach to community policing and engage all aspects of the community, not just a single aspect of the community. We are so fortunate, we here at the White House, that the National League of Cities have joined with us to really charge your members around the country over the next 30 days to really sit down and convene with faith leaders and people who have been leaders of the protest movements in your community, African American, Latinos, educators, etc., around the table for a meeting or two or three to literally leave all of your stereotypes at the door, sit down at the table and begin to look at what exists in your hometowns and begin to think with all the folks around the table, what can we do to bring about the change that we all want for the future of our country, and most specifically, the future of each of your individual communities. And then set up a game plan, an implementation plan that over time can bring aspects of the community together that otherwise would not have come together. Get people out of their comfort zones. Do an assessment of your police department. Read that task force report on 21st century community-oriented policing and see how many of those 52 recommendations are being implemented and ask why others are not. That's what we're about, and we appreciate so much the National League of Cities joining with us to make this as local as we possibly can, because that's where the change is going to occur. And I would add with just one other highlight, and that is tonight at 8 o'clock across the country, 8 o'clock Eastern time, ABC News and ESPN are going to carry a 1-hour town hall meeting with the president and a group of about 100 people that ABC is picking to have another frank, roll-up-your-sleeves discussion about what's going on, what can we do, and I would submit to you again as I conclude that what we can do can only happen at the sidewalk level, back in our hometowns where people come together and begin to understand that we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us, and we've got to play to those strengths and make sure we do away with the kinds of situations that have caused the problems that we have seen over these last week in these tragic, tragic events. Thank you, Clarence.
Great. Thank you, Jerry, and also Clarence for your remarks. We are pleased that we are joined by the City of Pittsburgh, Chief Valerie McDonald Roberts, who's the Chief Urban Affairs Office in the City of Pittsburgh, and also believe Chief McClay is also on the line as well, to share some of the work and how the city has been responding prior to obviously last week's events, and even more so kind of what's happening on the ground in Pittsburgh. So I'll turn it over to the city Pittsburgh to share some of their insights.
Okay, thank you. This is Valerie, and I'm honored to speak on behalf of our mayor, William Peduto. One thing that the mayor had implemented is to set the tone at the top. And I don't care what municipality you're in, whether it's small, whether it's rural, urban, large, if the tone is not set at the top for accountability, for intolerance to hate, to intolerance for abuse and misuse, then you're going to have problems. And that is a trickle down. So we have a mayor who has that tone. He believes in that passionately. And he has, when he started his administration, he hired people that would have the same vision. And two individuals I want to highlight, since we've had tragedies that involve public safety, is our chief, and I'll let him speak for himself, Chief Cameron McClay, who has done a phenomenal job, has taken some risks, has stuck his neck out there to make sure that this city remains calm. And so far we have had peaceful protests, we've had dialogue, and that didn't just happen haphazardly. That was quite organic because the tone was set at the top. The other individual is our director of our Office of Municipal Investigations. That would be equivalent to Internal Affairs, to make sure that there is a hybrid model of citizens and police that are not just aspirational for accountability, they actually enforce accountability and to make sure that their findings are neutral and exact, which helps the mayor, helps the chief, helps departments, helps everyone in the city to know where the problem areas are and how to correct them. So again, those are tones that are set at the top. Another thing that Mayor Peduto had implemented was a Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment, and that's what I'm the chief of the Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment, and that's a multi-pronged approach to the livability and the quality of living within the city of Pittsburgh. There are deputy chiefs and managers that all have responsibilities. And a couple of the responsibilities include education, workforce development, small business development, neighborhood redevelopment, early childhood education, equity and inclusion, welcoming Pittsburgh, immigrant, all issues related to immigration and new Americans. But within that, I'd like to highlight a couple of areas that I feel need to be actually drilled down upon throughout the nation. One is education. It all starts with education. You will find that there is less animosity, less racial divide when people have a higher degree of education. And that doesn't mean that you have to have college. It means that you have had adequate education in high school as a child to make sure that you're able to discern right from wrong, to make the right decisions. So Mayor Peduto, in 2013, when he was running for mayor, one of his platforms was universal pre-K. We are strongly in belief that that is one of the greatest solutions, because when you make sure that every child during their formative years is educated with values, with discernment, with acumen, that they're ready for kindergarten, that they're not going to fail, you will find that you're going to grow a population that's going to address the very issues that we're dealing with, I would call the tail end of things. We have to deal with the tail end of things, but we also have to deal at the beginning. And that's why his focus is also on universal pre-K. That is why we're going to have a manager an early childhood manager working with city council and the mayor's office collaboratively. Another thing is education. This is only me talking. I can't speak for the mayor on this, so I'm going out on a limb here. But I do believe we need curriculum changes within our schools to make sure that our children are educated in not only public safety issues, but municipal government, municipal issues. It's called civics. And I'm not sure if that is a great part. We talk about all other aspects of curriculum, but civics, common civics, how to conduct yourself. I think the more educated our children are with living in society and how to live in society and the mechanics that go into living in society, I think that we're going to have a population that kind of gets it, knows what to do. Workforce development, Mayor Peduto, what has worked is that he initiated Learn and Earn. What he did is, we called it summer youth employment at one time. Now it's Learn and Earn. This expansion went from 200 kids from 14 years of age through, I believe, 18, 19. He's expanded that from about 200 kids to 2,000 children. It was a major initiative in which we collaborated with Three Rivers Workforce Investment Board, with many of our foundations, the corporate community. This was a major endeavor where we all got together and put the money on the table to make sure that this was a feasible program, and that the goal is every child in the city of Pittsburgh who wants to learn and earn during the summer has that opportunity. And again, there were 2,000 children. It's being replicated again. Other things that the mayor's done is opening the doors to college interns and high school interns so they can be exposed to government. They can be exposed to how government works, how society works, what it is to be a civilian in the Pittsburgh area. So it's basically outreach, and more outreach. Tearing down silos. The mayor is big for saying we can no longer have silos, and we are tearing them down amongst our authorities. We talk to all the authorities, from our sports and exhibition authority to the housing authority, who takes care of 10 to 20,000 low-income people and provides the majority of low-income housing, to make sure that there is dialogue. And with that dialogue comes more of a partnering on issues that relate to race, that relate to socioeconomic division. So again, the mayor has an outreach tone, and so does the chief of police. And I will end it there and turn it over, Chief McClay, if you're on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep my comments very brief, but certainly be glad to expand on anything anyone wants me to add to. I think the introductory comments were absolutely on point with respect to mayors' ability to ensure that they have their police forces are led in such a way as to lead to perceptions in the community of just outcomes. In order for a police department to have legitimacy in the eyes of the communities it serves, it really has to have two critical components. Number one, it has to perform well. It has to perform to standard. In other words, people have to feel good, not just about, they have to feel safe in their communities, and they also have to recognize that when things aren't working, when they don't feel safe in their neighborhoods, or when their police aren't successful in reducing crime, fear, and disorder, that they have a voice and that they recognize that their voices are heard. So the introductory comments that we need to be looking toward, those research-based best practices, are absolutely right on point. And it's not that we have to have one size fits all, but every police organization has to hold itself accountable to the service that it provides to the community. So you have to have organizational performance. And there were some good recommendations with respect to the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing that would serve as a really good template for elected officials to look at their police force and help steer those kinds of questions. The other thing that every police force needs in order to be able to successfully navigate the difficult waters we're going through right now with respect to the legitimacy of police in the eyes of our communities of color is accountability. People need to know that their police force is holding themselves accountable. And when we talk about police accountability, too often the national dialogue right now is in whether or not officers are criminally charged or criminally indicted. The reality is that police can hold themselves accountable and should be holding themselves accountable to a much higher standard. So when there's, for example, a high-profile use of force incident, the question isn't simply, did the officer commit a crime? All right, so we can have an officer-involved shooting or use of force incident, which we could look at and say, no, the officer, while it's horrific to look at, there was no crime committed here. And so when the community see a lack of prosecution, they equate that with no accountability. The opportunity for police executives to earn legitimacy in the eyes of their community is to hold their members accountable to higher standards. So every police force should have use of force policies, pursuit policies, those high liability activities. You should have policies that set a higher standard than simply the low bar of criminal code. And so when someone is engaged in an officer is engaged in an incident, while what they did may not have been in violation of the crime, or may not constitute the commission of a crime, we can hold them accountable to policy standards. Okay, so we can hold them accountable. So if they violated a policy but didn't commit a crime, the community can still know that there was accountability. And then even then, if what the officer does is within doesn't constitute the commission of a crime, is within policy, an organization should still ask themselves, was the officer's performance consistent with best practices? Would we use what that officer did to train other officers? If not, there's still an opportunity to further develop our employees. So accountability that will earn legitimacy in the eyes of our community is really about holding our officers accountable to the highest standards of ethical performance. And I think the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing is absolutely an excellent template. It's a great starting point for looking at your police force and saying, are they performing to the best research-based best practices, and are mechanisms of accountability in play so that when you have an incident occur within your city, you can assure your community that your police force is holds them accountable to higher standards. And then, of course, there needs to be a measure of transparency with respect to that as well, so that the community knows knows what's happening behind the curtain of law enforcement, if you will. I'll stop my comments here because I know we've got a tight agenda, but happy to answer any questions people might have.
Great. Thank you, Chief McDonald Roberts, and also Chief McClay for joining at the last minute. It was great to hear both perspectives, both from the mayor's office, the work that is committed to really looking at prevention, investing early, but also the strong partnership that the city of Pittsburgh has with working with the police and the understanding the importance of the role that police play in the community. And as we've been reflecting at the National League of Cities on the past week, we also have been wanting to provide the cities a sense of what you can do as you're listening to our speakers, Clarence, Jeremy, listening to the White House with Jerry Abramson, as well as the city of Pittsburgh, about specific actions that you can do as leaders to really be focused on addressing and reacting to the violence that have been happening in the community. And how do you look at this from a racial equity lens? And so one recommendation, as you've heard from the effort that's coming through the White House, is the opportunity for you to be able to convene. And NLC is committed to working with cities that are willing, if you have it, looking to respond and create opportunities to really convene and create safe spaces for people to talk about race and to develop strategies for achieving equity. People most affected by these issues, residents and communities of color, police officers, as you heard, local leaders, have a lot to say. Great ideas for addressing these complex issues in your communities. And so cities that have been really on the forefront of this are thinking outside the box. They're inviting local media outlets into the space. You heard Jerry Abramson mention the event tonight, which ABC and ESPN are hosting. But for those that watched the ESPY Awards last night, the professional athletes they opened up the session just using it as an opportunity to acknowledge kind of how important this is and the voice that professional athletes in your cities can play, students and millennials. And so really being committed to listening as an elected official and bringing people together is an important thing you can do in your cities. And a number of cities are already leading in that space. But the second is about leadership. Clarence mentioned earlier that last year NLC created REAL, which stands for Race, Equity, and Leadership. And so when NLC had made this a priority, the leadership piece is so important to REAL. As we think about how we equip local elected officials with the capacity to understand the impacts of race and equity. And so what can you do as elected officials to be a vocal proponent in your community for racial equity policies, programs, and practices? How are you helping people find their roles as agents of change? One practical thing you can do is really look at your own leadership and really creating those spaces where you are a proponent and creating the space for as a community to really look at the policies and programs and the lens for you as a local leader. The third component is around building trust. And as a local leader, that is such an important role you play in really being able to build long-term relationships, standing meetings with key stakeholders, sustaining citywide dialogues, a number of incredible examples of city leaders creating programs, community ambassador programs, youth policing programs, Books to Bear in Rochester and St. Paul, the community ambassadors program that is happening there in that city. And the sustained long-term relationship is so important to this work as you're committed to addressing racial inequity. So as moments are happening, you are sustaining these deposits into a bank of trust. And so that for us as we are looking at best practices is such a critical component to what you're doing as a city to really be committed to addressing racial inequity. The fourth is also something you heard on this call, which is really getting the facts and being committed to understanding what the data is around racial disparities in your city. We know what gets counted gets attention. And so do you know how many arrests? Do you know the fines, tickets, the violent encounters, the citizen complaints that are issued to or by each racial group in your community? Cities that are able to use that data and get real data on police community interactions that are disaggregated by race is an important first step to developing solutions that will work for your community. And so really a commitment as a city and as a leader to getting the facts and using that to really drive the conversation. And then the last is the larger commitment as a city to change. And I think that was the theme as you really heard in the opening remarks by President Obama, what you're hearing in our leadership as an organization of really wanting to see change, meaningful change, looking at policy reform that could work in your city related to safe and just police interactions, independent oversight. You've heard over and over again the 21st Century Police Task Force report, the 52 recommendations, and so looking to those resources to help you to achieve meaningful change, and particularly as we're talking about this in a racial equity lens, understanding how to apply a racial equity lens to your broader policies, initiatives, programs, and budgets. And so NLC has toolkits and resources to help you get there. As you heard from Clarence earlier, really see ourselves as an organization that is committed to providing those tools and creating the space to also help you coordinate how you create the space in your cities, to have those conversations and to be able to be committed to meaningful and lasting change. And so there are a number of resources. These are just a few that tie to both local examples and also toolkits that we have on our website, nlc.org. But we wanted to use this as an opportunity to encourage you to see NLC as a resource. We have our upcoming summit in November 16th through the 17th. It's going to be in Pittsburgh, in the city of Pittsburgh. There'll be a number of things we're doing, hosting a leadership training on racial equity. And so we encourage you to register for the summit. And where you'll also go to the website and learn more about the agenda. So that was one resource we want to put in front of you. And why don't we use this now as an opportunity just to open it up for questions and questions for our panel. But in particular, we're excited that we have one of our a respondent, a partner with the National League of Cities, Julie Nelson, the Director for Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and also with the Haas Institute at University of California, Berkeley, and with the Center for Social Inclusion. So she'll be on the call as well, and to share some of her best practices as you're asking questions. We really are wanting to hear where individuals are. And so there is an opportunity for you to be able to ask your questions by typing into the question box for those that are obviously online through the webinar. If you in the question box, if you are able to put your question in there, we'll pose it to the panel, and in particular for Julie as a respondent. And as you do that, I'll give Julie just as a way of having a chance to provide some initial responses, kind of responding to what she's been hearing. And then as your questions are coming in, we'll pose some questions to the group. Julie?
Thanks, Leon. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the work that is going on through the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. As Leon and others have framed, it's really clear that race is in the headlines in a really urgent way currently, and it's important for those of us working within government to be able to be reactive to incidents that occur. And when I say incidents, we're talking about a broad range of incidents ranging from police shootings of Black men to the more day-to-day inequities that play out. And part of the approach that we take is not only being reactive, but also being proactive. That we know there are racial inequities across every single indicator for success, and it's not just a matter of random acts. That racial inequities have been intentionally created over the course of hundreds of years, and that if we want to get to different outcomes in our communities, it's really important that we have a sustainable, long-term approach that is going to actually use the leverage and power of government to get to those different outcomes. I'll pause there, and Leon, if there's questions, happy to respond to questions, and also happy to share a little bit more depth about the work of government and racial equity.
There are a few questions coming in online. Let me take care of some of the housekeeping questions. There was a question about, is this being recorded? And the answer is yes. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on NLC's website, nlc.org. And there was also a question about our copies of the presentation. And we will be sending out copies of the presentation and posting it on the website. So those are two logistical questions. But the first question, which I think is an interesting one to respond to, Julie or anyone else that's on the panel. As a Hispanic, this is coming from one of our local leaders. Many Hispanics have died during encounters with law enforcement compared to any other minority, but this is rarely mentioned. Why is that?
Well,
yeah, I think that
that certainly was there were Latino leaders in the meeting yesterday for 4.5 hours with the president, and the president was as focused on any of the interest groups that unfortunately, or the segments of the community is a better way to say it, who have unfortunately found that situations have arisen where they haven't been treated equally, fairly, or justly. And the Latino perspective was very, very clearly made in the meeting yesterday with the president. And so his desire to have these at least 100 convenings in communities across the country is really a drumbeat to pull Latino leaders, African American leaders, white leaders who wish to bring about change, as well as faith leaders, elected officials, police department leadership, to sit around that table and work through these issues in an honest and forthright way.
I would add that to Jerry's point around what happens at the local level, that many of the jurisdictions that we're working with do disaggregate data, and it's important to name the disproportionalities across racial groups, that it is not just a black and white issue, and we need to be specific around the differences of who's impacted, and from a policy perspective, who's benefiting, who's burdened by different policy decisions. The question around policy is a critical one, that we know that policies have historically created racial inequities, but now living with the legacy of disproportionality and policies that have been created, we have to not only change policy, but we also have to change culture. The organizational cultures that are implementing policies, we know, especially thinking about criminal justice, that we can change policy after policy, but if we're not changing the underlying relationship between officers and community, then we're not going to have the impact we're looking for. And being really clear from a disaggregated data perspective where the challenges are, you know, we have to be able to do that. So appreciate the question, and I think it's something we need to keep on the table.
Thank you
and
both.
The White House with the National League of Cities, we have technical assistance we can give to any community. We right now have 48 different police departments that are literally working with us on data-driven approach where anyone in the public in a community can get online and find out that Officer 573 over the last month has stopped X number of people with red hair and glasses, or a person of color, or only stops females. All of that data can be reported and put out on the web for citizens in the community to follow, and then hold the police chief and the elected officials accountable for what might be going on. If you need technical assistance in that area, work with the NLC. We've got the folks here at the White House to be able to support that effort for you.
Great. Well, this really builds on another question that around trust from another one of our local leaders. How do you trust someone or a police system when you can see in real time that they aren't trustworthy?
Yeah, I think that the importance of changing the underlying relationship between police and community, that requires development of trust. Because of historical legacies, we know that change in trust, just because police departments, police chiefs, police officers say, trust me, there is no reason for that to take place until it's demonstrated. People have to earn trust, and that comes about via longer term work together, that people have to demonstrate the commitment. So I don't think it's a realistic expectation for trust to be automatic.
Yeah. And Chief,
but for us to get to change, have to build that trust.
And I don't know if Chief McClay is on the phone as well. If you want to share some of the things in Pittsburgh that you're doing as well to really speak to that building trust. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and and that was one of the things we talked about in the White House during the president's convening, and certainly has been my experience here. You know, the relationships have to be built over time, and the conversations should be occurring before the crisis happens. And so, you know, in my just coming up on 2 years now, I really prioritize the development of those relationships with my community leaders, particularly with particular emphasis on those where the trust gaps were the widest. And the benefit to that in the development of those relationships is, as the president talked about, is that recognition that there is that place in the middle, and the police and the community want the same things. And that's one of the beautiful things that comes from that very purposeful, very intentional reaching out and developing relationships over time and having repeated conversations. Trust comes A, from the development of the relationship, and then B, being seen as in my case as a police chief, to hold myself accountable. And so when issues are brought, whether they're issues of crime and disorder in the communities or whether they're issues of police accountability for alleged misconduct, when a police leader is seen to hold himself and themselves accountable for issues brought to their attention, trust is developed. And so it's absolutely true that trust is not going to happen on the first meeting or the fifth meeting, but it's going to be developed over time, where you develop genuine human relationships of mutual respect, and then being seen to hold yourself accountable and having the courage to hold your members accountable when people make a mistake, when we don't have our best day. And then it's critically important, and I've had to have this conversation with a number of my faith-based leaders, having the moral courage to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the shared history. I'm sorry for the role my profession has played in the harm that has been caused to our communities of color. And I'm sorry for the days where we didn't have our best day, but I'm going to hold myself accountable for making sure that from now on, we're going to try to work together with you to find more just ways for us to deliver our police services. So trust is something we have to earn.
Right.
This is Valerie. I also want to add in here that we also have a Citizens Academy where people in the general public can have a little course in understanding police operations. And they work very closely with the police officers over, I forget how many weeks. It was instituted back in the 90s. And it's a smaller way, but in a very effective way for people to understand what a police officer does, the procedures, and what they have to do as they monitor the streets. I think that trust is also built on understanding. It doesn't just come out of the blue. You have to understand the other person, and almost like with this academy, walk in their shoes for just a little while. Just walk in their shoes, and maybe they'll understand. And if you have more of that, as well as police officers in the community, in our schools, again, I stress, we cannot forget, as we deal with the tail end of things and race relations as they're exploding right now, we cannot forget that we have to be proactive and really impact our youth, our children, to grow up, to make sure that we're not dealing with the tail end of things again. We don't want to revisit this. We want things to get better. So it has to be a two-pronged approach. The police officers do need to build that trust up with the young people in our community. The younger, the better. And there's a mutual understanding. But again, it's just one effort to make sure that there is trust. It's called understanding one another and educating one another.
I'd love to share another example of some innovative practice. City of Tacoma, Washington has had a project that's called Project Peace that is about dialogues between community and police officers. And the thing that's a little bit different about it is that it's not just focused on communication, but is also naming the historical relationship between police and communities of color and acknowledging the way that institutional and structural racism have created inequities. And these conversations are done between community and police officers so that there's really a foundation from which there can then be conversation around next steps, around taking action to get to different outcomes. I think that there's a certain level of frustration that we have had lots and lots of conversations, and it's really time to focus our attention on actions that are going to get us to different outcomes. Yeah. So if you're interested in that, it's Project Peace, City of Tacoma, Washington.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And that was in our blog that NLC put out, and we can send that out in the email that I had posted. That was one of the examples we listed in terms of lifting up the City of Tacoma's Project Peace. So we'll send that link out in an email. And just building on the last 2 points, one of the questions asked by another local leader, what was an example of can you give an example of how a city has used in a proactive way a racial equity tool? And maybe Julie, you can highlight. May I ask you to highlight an example you have?
Yeah, I actually wanted to talk about the city of St. Paul and Mayor Coleman. St. Paul has been working on an explicit racial equity strategy for 3 or 4 years right now. And what that has meant is that they have developed racial equity action plans across all departments, not just police departments, but every department has an action plan, and they use a racial equity tool in budget decisions and in program and policy decisions. An example, a specific example of what they have done, which I think is a wonderful example because it was acknowledging of historical legacies. There was a community called the Rondo community that was historically an African American neighborhood, but when urban renewal happened and the highway went in, a huge number of houses were lost and the community was split in two. And it's one of those things that when I talk about the reality that inequities were intentionally created, it's a great example. And so the city had identified that as one of the historical legacies that they were really trying to address. And they used a tool to analyze what the impacts were right now and to develop some strategies to provide more positive outcomes. And so what they ended up doing is Mayor Coleman issued an apology for what had happened historically, and recognizing that apologies by themselves are not sufficient, that there needs to be changes there needs to be actions. Mayor Coleman made an investment in the Rondo Community Center and had some community engagement around that community center, and looked at it as a real cornerstone of what the neighborhood was, is, could be, and should be. And all of that was done using a racial equity tool and using a racial equity analysis.
Great. Well, and let me just, building on that, Mayor Coleman, St. Paul, Minnesota, as well as the police chief, Axel, were with the president yesterday as well, sharing some of those perspectives in that closed room meeting that Jerry Abramson mentioned as well. And so it's just another nice tie into creating the room and space for those very concrete examples about what needs to be happening in local cities and the actions that you need that you can take as local leaders. And so as we wrap up, I do want to just bring into the room a comment that was shared online. I gave an example of what's happening in Roanoke, Virginia. It says here in Roanoke, we started race and community relation conversations early. Our mayor is holding a summer basketball league for the second summer in a row in partnership with the police department. Our vice mayor also holds an annual youth summit. We found starting the conversation early 2 years ago has helped with race relations, especially between government and citizens. And just really their question was, anyone else have success with community events or in prior events hosting these conversations? And I thought that was a great question to really to share largely with those that are listening in. We want to create a space where we're hearing about what you are doing to have conversations in your communities. Following recent events that have happened last week, if you have started to have those conversations, we want to hear from you. If you can email us at real@nlc.org, that's real@nlc.org, to share those stories, your examples. We want to be able to compile those, share those as well with the White House as they are wanting to know who is having those conversations. And we want to create a space where we can be lifting those examples up. So again, if you're having those conversations or looking to have those conversations, please email us at real@nlc.org. We also want to encourage, again, for those that are members of the National League of Cities or are looking to attend our annual City Summit in Pittsburgh on November 16th through the 19th. We will be having a leadership training on racial equity and creating spaces for you as local elected officials to be able to have the tools and resources you need to be more effective to lead and to create the change that we're having on that we've been talking about. And also, if I can, maybe put up our contact information. You can email me directly. It's andrews@nlc.org. So that's andrews@nlc.org. If you have any questions or in any follow-up that you have with us, and we'll again just want to thank each of our panelists for your participation. Thanks to our CEO Clarence Anthony for really setting the tone for the conversation, and Jerry Abramson from the White House just really helping us understand how important this is for the president and the city of Pittsburgh as well, for just giving us very concrete examples, and Julie always for just giving a broader sense of the work that's happening across the country. Thanks, everyone. Again, thanks for your participation. Have a good rest of the afternoon. Take care.